We will be exploring one of the most fascinating encounters in the Bible, the story of Abraham and the three strangers. It's a powerful story that teaches us about faith, hospitality, and the incredible promises of God. Have you ever wondered how showing kindness to strangers could change your life? Or how God works even through the most impossible situations? Well, this story has all of that and more. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you don't miss out on more biblical stories, life lessons, and inspiring content that helps you grow in your faith. And if you're already a part of our community, welcome back. Drop a comment below and let me know what aspect of Abraham's story resonates most with you. All right, let's get into the story of Abraham, the three strangers, and the life-changing lessons we can learn from their encounter. The story of Abraham and the three strangers is found in Book of Genesis chapter 18 from verses 1 to 15. This remarkable encounter reveals much about Abraham's character, his faith in God, and his hospitality toward others. It also provides deep spiritual lessons for Christians. One day, as Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent near the great trees of Mamre, the Lord appeared to him in the form of three strangers. The Bible states that three men suddenly appeared to Abraham as he looked up from where he sat. Although these men appeared to be ordinary travelers, Abraham sensed something divine about them. It's widely believed that one of these figures was a pre-incarnate appearance of the Lord, Yahweh, and the other two were angels. Upon seeing them, Abraham immediately rose, bowed low to the ground in a gesture of respect, and extended an invitation to the strangers to rest and refresh themselves. He offered them water to wash their feet and shade to rest under a tree. He also promised them a meal. Abraham's hospitality was generous and humble. He hurried into the tent and asked his wife Sarah to bake some bread. Then he ran to his herd, selected a tender calf, and gave it to a servant to prepare. When the food was ready, Abraham served it to the strangers and stood nearby as they ate. The hospitality shown by Abraham reflects not just the customs of the time, but also his deep sense of reverence and care for others, even strangers. After eating, one of the strangers, identified as the Lord, asked about Sarah, Abraham's wife. He then made a startling announcement. Sarah would have a son within a year despite her old age. Sarah, who was listening from inside the tent, laughed to herself as she and Abraham were both elderly, well past the age of childbearing. The Lord responded by asking Abraham why Sarah laughed and doubted the promise, saying, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" This was a reminder of God's power and ability to fulfill His promises, regardless of human limitations. When confronted, Sarah denied laughing out of fear, but the Lord corrected her, affirming that she did, in fact, laugh. This part of the story describes both human frailty, Sarah's doubt and disbelief, and God's patient correction. Despite Sarah's initial skepticism, God's promise stood firm. Following the announcement about Sarah's son, the three strangers rose to leave and looked towards Sodom. God chose to reveal His plan to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah to Abraham. Abraham, in a moment of profound humility and courage, interceded on behalf of the city, asking God to spare it if righteous people could be found there. This part of the story highlights Abraham's compassion and his role as an intercessor, even for people he knew were wicked. This great story is filled with amazing lessons for us Christians of today to learn from and apply in our daily lives. The first one is the importance of hospitality. The importance of hospitality is powerfully illustrated in Abraham's encounter with the three strangers. Abraham, seated by his tent, immediately ran to greet these visitors, offering food, rest, and comfort, not knowing at first that they were divine messengers. His actions were an outpouring of genuine kindness, showing the significance of hospitality in the biblical narrative. This event reminds us of the call in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, where Christians are instructed to not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Abraham's spontaneous generosity reflects his character, one rooted in faith, humility, and love for others. He didn't question who the strangers were or what they wanted, but instead welcomed them with an open heart. As Christians today, we can take this story as a model for our own lives. The practice of hospitality is not just about sharing food or shelter, it's a reflection of God's love and compassion. By opening our hearts and homes to others, we mirror the very nature of God, who welcomes all into His presence. In modern times, hospitality may look different, like helping a neighbor in need, volunteering to serve at a local community, or offering our time and resources to those going through difficult seasons. In an increasingly disconnected world, these simple acts of kindness create powerful connections and demonstrate Christ's love. When we serve others with open hands and hearts, we never know how God might use our actions to impact lives, including our own. Hospitality, as seen in Abraham's story, is not limited to those we are familiar with. Abraham showed kindness to strangers, and it resulted in a divine encounter and blessings beyond his imagination. Similarly, Christians are called to extend hospitality not just to friends or family, but also to strangers, reminding us that every act of love and service can have eternal significance. The second key lesson from Abraham's encounter with the three strangers is the importance of trusting in God's promises, even when they seem impossible. Sarah's reaction, laughing at the idea of bearing a child in her old age, perfectly captures the natural human tendency to doubt when circumstances appear beyond hope. At this point, Sarah and Abraham were advanced in years, well beyond the normal age for childbirth. Her laughter wasn't out of joy but disbelief, reflecting how easy it is for us to be swayed by what seems realistic or possible in our limited view. But God's response, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" is a powerful statement that reminds us of His omnipotence. God's promises transcend human limitations, physical laws, and circumstances. In this story, Sarah's doubt was met with a firm yet loving reminder that God is not bound by what we perceive as possible. The birth of Isaac, which came exactly as God had promised, illustrates that no matter how improbable a situation might seem, God's word will always prevail. For Christians today, this lesson speaks directly to the heart of faith and patience. We often face situations that seem impossible, whether it's waiting for provision during a financial crisis, seeking healing from illness, or holding on to a dream that feels out of reach. Just like Sarah, we may be tempted to laugh in disbelief, questioning how God can work through the overwhelming circumstances we face. However, the story encourages believers to hold fast to God's promises and trust His timing. God is always faithful, and His ways are higher than ours. When we surrender our doubts and fears, we allow God to work in ways that surpass our understanding. Trusting in God's promises also requires patience. Sometimes the fulfillment of those promises takes time, but God's timing is always perfect. In moments of waiting, Christians are called to reflect on God's faithfulness in the past and trust that He is capable of doing the impossible in the future. Whether we are waiting for personal breakthroughs, restoration, or guidance, the lesson is clear. Nothing is too hard for the Lord. This is a powerful reminder that in our walk of faith, God is sovereign over all things, and He will fulfill His word in His perfect time and way. The third lesson from the story of Abraham and the three strangers is a profound one: God's patience with our weaknesses. Sarah's laughter at the announcement that she would bear a child at her old age reveals a very human reaction to seemingly impossible situations: doubt, insecurity, and disbelief. Her laughter, followed by her denial of it when confronted by God, reflects how we often try to cover up or justify our lack of faith, fearing judgment or embarrassment. Yet what stands out in this story is God's response. Rather than punishing Sarah or rebuking her harshly for her disbelief, God reaffirmed His promise to Abraham and Sarah. He didn't withdraw his blessing or retract his words because of Sarah's weak faith. Instead, he gently reminded them both of his power and his plan, saying, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" This illustrates God's incredible patience and mercy in the face of human frailty. Sarah's moment of doubt is something many of us can relate to. In times of uncertainty, we might question God's promises or struggle with fears and insecurities. But just as God was patient with Sarah, He is patient with us. He understands our weaknesses, knowing that we are prone to fear, doubt, and hesitation. Yet, instead of abandoning us when our faith falters, He meets us with grace and continues to work in our lives, gently calling us to trust Him more fully. For Christians today, this is a comforting reminder that God's relationship with us isn't conditional on the strength of our faith. When we struggle with doubt or fear, He doesn't cast us aside. Instead, He works with us through our weaknesses, encouraging us to grow in faith. His patience is not a license for complacency, but a loving invitation to step forward in trust, knowing that even when we stumble, He remains faithful. This also encourages believers to extend patience and grace toward others who may be wrestling with their faith. Just as God is patient with us, we are called to support and encourage one another, understanding that everyone's faith journey involves moments of doubt. In the end, Sarah's disbelief did not prevent God's promise from being fulfilled, and the same applies to our lives. Even when we falter, God's mercy is greater than our weakness, and He continues to guide us toward His purpose. Christians can rest in the assurance that God's patience with our weaknesses is a reflection of His loving character. He sees beyond our immediate reactions and works through our doubts, reminding us that His promises will always come to pass. When we acknowledge our own frailty and turn to Him, we can be confident that He is patient, merciful, and always ready to lead us back to His perfect path. The fourth lesson from the story of Abraham and the three strangers is the role of intercession, as demonstrated by Abraham's bold and compassionate prayers on behalf of the city of Sodom. This act of intercession reveals the significant responsibility and privilege that believers have in praying for others, even those who are distant from God. When God revealed His plan to judge Sodom for its wickedness, Abraham didn't remain silent or indifferent. Instead, he stepped forward with boldness and compassion, asking God to spare the city if even a small number of righteous people could be found. Abraham began by asking God to spare the city if 50 righteous people were present, and continued to negotiate with God all the way down to 10. This persistence in prayer shows how deeply Abraham cared for the people, even those living in sin. He was willing to plead with God on their behalf, trusting in God's justice and mercy. What's remarkable is how God responded. Rather than becoming angry or dismissive of Abraham's repeated requests, God listened patiently and agreed to his terms. This exchange demonstrates that God is willing to hear our prayers and take them into account, even when we are praying for people who seem far from Him. Abraham's intercession did not change God's righteous judgment, but it showed the importance of appealing to God's mercy, and it set an example of how we should be willing to stand in the gap for others. For modern Christians, this lesson in intercession is powerful. We live in a world where we witness injustice, sin, and brokenness all around us. Yet we are called not to judge or condemn, but to intercede. Just as Abraham prayed for Sodom, we are called to pray for our families, friends, communities, and even people we may never meet. This includes praying for those who are far from God, asking for His mercy and intervention in their lives. The role of intercession is a profound act of love. It reflects the heart of Christ, who is our ultimate intercessor, continually praying on our behalf before God. When we intercede for others, we mirror that heart of compassion, acknowledging that we, too, are in need of God's mercy. Intercession is also a way of acknowledging that no one is beyond the reach of God's grace. Abraham knew how wicked Sodom was, yet he still sought God's mercy for the city. This teaches us not to give up on anyone, no matter how far they seem from God. Christians today should recognize the power of prayer and the call to intercede for others. We can intercede for our loved ones, communities, leaders, and even those we consider enemies. Prayer is a powerful tool that connects us to God's heart and allows us to participate in His work of redemption in the world. Through intercession, we become agents of God's mercy, bringing before Him the needs, hurts, and brokenness of the people around us. And while we may not always see immediate results, we trust that God hears every prayer and will respond according to His perfect will. This lesson encourages us to be persistent, compassionate, and bold in our prayers, trusting that God is both just and merciful. The fifth learning point from the story of Abraham and the three strangers is God's power and sovereignty. The miraculous promise of a son for Abraham and Sarah, despite their advanced age, serves as a powerful testament to God's sovereignty and limitless power. Human logic and limitations could never have predicted that a woman of Sarah's age, who had long passed the childbearing years, would conceive a child. Yet God's promise to Abraham, which was made many years before, was not dependent on human capabilities but solely on His divine will and purpose. In the story, when Sarah laughs at the idea of bearing a child, it reveals a natural human response to what seemed impossible. But God's response to her disbelief, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" is a distinct reminder that nothing, absolutely nothing, is beyond the power of God. This rhetorical question cuts to the heart of Christian faith, encouraging believers to put their trust in the sovereignty of God, who can accomplish what seems impossible by human standards. The miraculous birth of Isaac was not just a blessing for Abraham and Sarah, but a fulfillment of God's larger plan to create a nation through which the Messiah, Jesus Christ, would come. God had a redemptive purpose for the world, and not even the limitations of human frailty or doubt could stop His sovereign plan from unfolding. This shows that God's purposes are far-reaching, and His plans are always fulfilled in His perfect time and way. For Christians, this story teaches us several important truths about God's power and sovereignty. The first key lesson is that God is in control. This foundational truth serves as a bedrock of faith for Christians, assuring us that regardless of the challenges and obstacles we encounter in life, God remains sovereign over all. God's sovereignty means that He holds ultimate authority and power over creation and history. In moments of personal struggle, whether it's battling infertility, facing chronic illness, or enduring financial hardships, believers are encouraged that God is intimately aware of their situations. He is not distant or uninvolved. Rather, He is present and actively working. The story of Abraham illustrates this beautifully. Despite Abraham and Sarah's old age and the impossibility of bearing children, God had a plan that transcended their understanding. This reminds us that no matter how insurmountable our challenges appear, they are not beyond God's ability to intervene. On a broader scale, we live in a world filled with turmoil, conflict, and suffering. Wars, natural disasters, and social injustice often lead to feelings of despair and hopelessness. Yet God's sovereignty reassures us that He remains in control, even when circumstances seem chaotic. The Bible reminds us that God is not caught off guard by world events. Instead, He has a divine plan that will ultimately lead to His glory and the good of His people. For Christians, this understanding fosters a sense of hope and stability amidst uncertainty, reminding us that God is working in ways we may not yet see. The call to trust in God's plan is also a central theme in the Christian faith, one that encourages believers to lean into God's promises, even in the face of uncertainty. This call is particularly profound during times of waiting or suffering, where the human instinct is often to rush or take control. However, as demonstrated in the lives of Abraham and Sarah, true faith involves resting in the assurance that God is in charge, even when circumstances seem bleak or slow to change. Trusting God means placing our confidence in His character, His promises, and His timing. In a world that often prioritizes immediate gratification, this can be a difficult lesson to learn. Trusting God requires a shift in perspective. It is an acknowledgement that we may not have all the answers, and that we are not meant to have complete control over our lives. Just as Abraham had to step out in faith, leaving his homeland with no clear picture of what lay ahead, Christians today are invited to follow suit. This act of faith is not blind. Rather, it is based on a deep understanding of God's faithfulness throughout history. Waiting can feel like an exercise in futility, especially when it stretches on for what seems like an eternity. Abraham and Sarah's wait for their promised son was not just a few months, it was decades of waiting and wondering if the promise would ever be fulfilled. Similarly, many believers may find themselves in seasons of waiting for answers to prayers about relationships, health, financial stability, or personal dreams. This waiting period can bring feelings of doubt, frustration, and anxiety. However, the Bible assures us that God's delays are not denials. The call to trust requires surrendering our desire for immediate results. In our human nature, we often seek quick fixes and instant solutions, but God's ways are not our ways. Surrendering means letting go of our timelines and expectations, and instead, embracing God's perfect timing. This requires a level of humility, recognizing that God's plans may be different from ours, but they are ultimately for our good. As believers, we are called to submit our desires and expectations to God, trusting that He knows what is best for us and will provide in His perfect timing. Shifting our perspective can significantly aid in our journey of trust. When faced with challenges, it's easy to focus on the problem rather than the solution. Abraham's story teaches us that God is not just concerned about the outcome, but is equally invested in our growth during the waiting period. He uses these times to strengthen our faith, develop our character, and draw us closer to Him. As Romans chapter 8, verse 28 reminds us, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." Trusting God means believing that even in the waiting, He is actively working for our good. Understanding that God's timing is perfect can help alleviate anxiety during seasons of waiting. Just as Abraham and Sarah's story eventually culminated in the birth of Isaac, a fulfillment of God's promise. Christians today are encouraged to hold on to hope, knowing that God is orchestrating events in their lives in His time. This perfect timing is often intertwined with His greater purposes, which may extend beyond our immediate understanding. Building trust in God involves practical steps. Prayer becomes essential, allowing believers to communicate their fears, doubts, and desires to God. Reading Scripture can also provide encouragement and reassurance, reminding us of God's faithfulness in the past. Surrounding ourselves with a supportive community of fellow believers who can offer encouragement and perspective during tough times can also strengthen our faith. The call to trust is a lifelong journey. Each season of waiting can deepen our reliance on God and shape our understanding of His character. By embracing this journey, believers can experience a richer, more profound relationship with God. The act of trusting, especially in times of difficulty, becomes a testament to our faith, serving as a beacon of hope not only for ourselves but also for those around us who may be witnessing our journey. Embracing the truth that God is in control can bring profound peace. When we acknowledge that our circumstances do not dictate God's power or His ability to fulfill His promises, we can find rest for our souls. Philippians chapter 4, verse 6 to 7 encourages believers to bring their worries to God in prayer, promising that the peace of God will guard our hearts and minds. This peace stems from knowing that God is actively involved in every aspect of our lives. Recognizing God's sovereignty calls for a profound response of faith that shapes our understanding of the world around us. It challenges us to look beyond our immediate situations and trust that God has a purpose, even when we cannot see it clearly. This recognition is not merely an abstract concept, but a transformative realization that influences how we engage with life's uncertainties and trials. Abraham exemplified this faith when he welcomed the 3 strangers into his home. His willingness to offer hospitality, despite the burdens he carried and the promises that seemed delayed, reflects a deep trust in God's plan and provision. He didn't merely acknowledge God's sovereignty, he actively participated in it through his actions. Abraham's example teaches us that true faith is not passive but is demonstrated through our choices and behaviors. Even when the promise of a child seemed impossible, Abraham's response was one of openness and generosity. He chose to act in faith rather than succumb to doubt or despair. As Christians, we are called to model this faith in our daily lives, demonstrating our trust in God's sovereignty through our actions, words, and attitudes. This might mean responding with grace in difficult circumstances, offering help to those in need, or sharing our faith with others, all while maintaining an unwavering belief that God is working behind the scenes. Our faith can be a powerful testimony to those around us, showing them that we believe in a God who is actively involved in our lives and who has a plan for each of us. As Christians today, we are encouraged to embrace the reality of God's control in our lives. In times of personal difficulties, such as illness, loss, or financial struggles, it can be easy to feel overwhelmed or helpless. However, by recognizing God's sovereignty, we find comfort and assurance that He is in charge, even in our pain. Similarly, when we observe global crises such as wars, natural disasters, or social injustices, we are reminded that God remains sovereign over all these events. This understanding empowers us to respond with compassion and action rather than fear or resignation. Understanding God's sovereignty not only strengthens our faith, but also empowers us to navigate life's challenges with hope and resilience. When we trust in God's plan and timing, we are better equipped to face obstacles. This trust allows us to experience the peace that surpasses all understanding, anchoring our hearts in the knowledge that God is ultimately in control. It frees us from the burden of having to understand everything or control outcomes, leading us to a place of rest and assurance in His perfect plan. Furthermore, this faith transforms our perspective. It encourages us to see challenges as opportunities for growth and to approach life with a mindset of expectancy. When we recognize that God is sovereign, we can view trials as part of a larger narrative that God is weaving. This perspective fosters a sense of purpose and intentionality, prompting us to seek God's guidance and to trust that He is using our experiences for our good and His glory. Just as Sarah and Abraham had to wait decades for the fulfillment of God's promise, we too must sometimes wait on God. His timing is not always aligned with our desires or expectations, but it is always perfect. The birth of Isaac came at the exact moment God intended, and it fit into the broader story of His redemptive plan. Similarly, God's timing in our lives may not always make sense to us, but we can rest assured that it is for our ultimate good and His glory. This story reinforces the truth that nothing is too hard for God, whether it's a miracle in our personal lives like healing, provision, or a restored relationship, or a broader issue like peace in a conflict-ridden world. We are reminded that God's power knows no bounds. Christians can take comfort in knowing that we serve a God who can do the impossible and who delights in showing His strength in our weakness. The knowledge of God's sovereignty should lead believers to a place of rest and peace. Rather than striving to make things happen by our own strength or manipulating circumstances to fit our desired outcomes, we can rest in the knowledge that God is in control. His plans are always for our good, and even when we don't understand the why or when, we can trust that God's purposes will be fulfilled in His perfect way. We live in a world that often feels chaotic, unpredictable, and full of uncertainty, yet God's sovereignty offers us hope and security. Whether we are facing personal trials, waiting for the fulfillment of a promise, or witnessing difficulties on a global scale, we can trust that God is actively working in every situation. His power is greater than any obstacle, and He is sovereign over all things. This truth should deepen our faith, reminding us to surrender our worries and fears to God and trust that He is working all things together for good. As we walk in faith, may we continue to rest in the assurance that God's power is limitless and His plan is always perfect. In conclusion, the story of Abraham and the three strangers offers deep spiritual insights for modern Christians, highlighting essential truths that resonate with our everyday lives. From the importance of hospitality to the need for faith in God's promises, this narrative not only illustrates key virtues but also reveals profound aspects of God's character, His power, patience, and unwavering faithfulness. Abraham's example of hospitality serves as a powerful reminder that our actions can reflect God's love to those around us. In a world that often feels disconnected, showing kindness and generosity can bridge gaps and foster community. When we open our hearts and homes to others, we create opportunities for meaningful connections and demonstrate the love of Christ in tangible ways. The simple act of welcoming others can be transformative, both for us and for those we serve. The story underscores the necessity of faith in God's promises, especially during uncertain times. Abraham and Sarah's journey of waiting for the fulfillment of God's word teaches us that our understanding of time and circumstances is often limited. However, God's promises remain true, and His timing is always perfect. In our lives, we may face situations that seem impossible or delayed, but this narrative encourages us to hold steadfast to our faith, trusting that God is actively working in our lives, even when we cannot see the full picture. Understanding the character of God is another crucial takeaway from this story. His power to fulfill His promises, His patience with our doubts, and His faithfulness in all circumstances serve as a source of comfort and strength for believers. As we face challenges, whether personal struggles or global issues, we can rest in the assurance that God is sovereign and in control. His ability to work through our imperfect situations assures us that we are never alone in our trials. As we navigate the complexities of life, we can find solace in the knowledge that God is continually at work, often behind the scenes. This recognition encourages us to remain vigilant and prayerful, seeking His guidance in all aspects of our lives. The story invites us to embrace a posture of expectation, anticipating how God might be moving in ways we cannot yet understand. By embracing these lessons, Christians today are called to grow in faith, showing kindness to others, trusting in God's plan, and remaining steadfast in prayer. This holistic approach to living out our faith allows us to become instruments of God's grace in our communities. When we act with hospitality, trust in God's promises, and exhibit patience, we reflect the heart of God and inspire others to seek Him. This story of Abraham and the three strangers is not just a historical account, but a rich spiritual lessons that encourage modern believers to deepen their relationship with God. It challenges us to step out in faith, extending love and kindness to those around us while holding fast to the truth of God's faithfulness. As we embody these principles in our daily lives, we can cultivate a community that mirrors the love and grace of Christ, and at the same time drawing others closer to Him. Wow, what an amazing story, right? Abraham's encounter with the three strangers is packed with so many great lessons, from showing hospitality to trusting in God's promises even when they seem impossible. It's a beautiful reminder that God's timing is perfect and that nothing is too hard for Him. So, what did you take away from today's story? We will love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget that kindness, patience, and trust in God's plan are principles that we can apply every single day. If you found value in today's video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need encouragement. And as always, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on those notifications so you can join me on this journey of learning and growing through the Bible. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay blessed and keep walking in faith.